Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the We Draw the Lines Redistricting Virtual Forum. I'm Natasha Sutherland, Deputy Director of Florida Watch, here to moderate this very important conversation. Let's go ahead and kick it over to our slide deck, please. All right, if we can go to the agenda slide, let's talk about what we're going to talk about this evening. So first, we're going to go ahead and recap our statewide education tour with a video. We're going to provide some background on redistricting with a map comparison. We'll also review Florida's 2022 election results and update you all on the Supreme Court cases and the state trial. Finally, we're going to close on this call to action for the rest of you out there at home. So let's get started. Next slide, please. All right, so it's just taken a little bit of a moment to load, but the video that you're about to watch documents our journey throughout Florida during our 2022 redistricting tour. So you can go ahead and play the video, please.
Gerrymandering is just drawing the lines so that you exclude or include enough people in that district so that you get your way.
So you've heard of sunshine laws where we can make a public records request and we can see all of the communication that's happening between our legislators. They can see you, email it towards them. They can make a request on any bills or conversations that you're having. Redistricting is the only issue that is not required to be in the sunshine.
You want to talk about why this matters to you. What is the issue? What is the value that brought you here to this room today that you can then take out in the world to bring somebody with you to the book?
Tom Clark, he served on the United States Supreme Court back in 1961. And in his opinion in the Maps versus Ohio, he said nothing can destroy the government more quickly than its failure to observe its own laws.
The DeSantis plan violates the Florida Constitution by intentionally favoring the Republican Party and disfavoring the Democratic Party.
I just want us to understand what is going on and for us to start articulating that only some laws are all enforced when it comes to law. And laws that certain people don't like, not only are they not enforced, they're violated.
The maps that we are focusing on, that we are bringing attention to as it pertains to this lawsuit, as it stated, is C5, C9, C10, C7, 13, 14, 26, and 27.
Our legislature in 2022 had told us they were going to adhere to the Fair District Amendments, that they were going to protect our racial voting districts that were in place as required by the Florida Supreme Court, which we just talked about. That's not what happens.
So what are we asking for? So we're asking to prohibit the use of the DeSantis map and to require a new congressional map for future elections.
This year was drastically different than any previous year because the governor himself chose to influence, draw, and submit a map from his office.
This is unprecedented for a governor to insert himself into this process. So by us allowing this to go on without fighting in the courts, unfortunately, or without holding our legislature and our governor accountable, whether it be while they're in office and we're talking to them in their districts or at the ballot box, we are setting the stage for this sort of behavior to continue the next 10 years and for it to catch fire.
The point that we want to drive home here is that you have to do your part to vote all the way down the ballot.
Thank you so much. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we hope that the recap and the video was helpful in grounding the conversation. I just want to go ahead and shout out the organizations that have made all this possible. We've got Equal Ground, Florida League of Women Voters, Black Voters Matter, and Florida Rising. So for the next segment, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Cecile. Cecile Schoon serves as the co-president of the League of Women Voters of Florida to go ahead and get this conversation started. Cecile.
Thank you. This is such an important conversation, and I really enjoyed the recap. So we want to give you a little history on redistricting. And Florida has a process that's a wonderful process. It allows citizens, when they gather together and they believe in a particular issue, they can actually make the law and they can amend our Constitution. And we all got together and we created an amendment to the Constitution called Fair Districts. And that was to limit, when they redistrict, to block out minority votes and to give one party an unfair advantage over the other. Next slide. Yes, and in 2010, after the fair districts were passed, the Florida legislators, they promised to follow the law. They said, oh yes, we understand the citizens have done this and we're going to be fair. It turned out that they did not keep their word. We actually had emails where they were intentionally trying to limit the voices of African Americans and those outside of their party, which would be anybody but a Republican. The same thing happened in 2022. It's like a revisit, a deja vu. And what happened initially, the legislators, which were, again, led primarily by Republicans, to their credit, they initially promised to follow the law. And in legislative sessions and hearings, they refused the governor's pressure to limit the voices of African Americans. And they said that they would follow the guidance of the Supreme Court, which said that the fair districts were the law of the land. But the governor was not satisfied with that. He continued to attack our fair districts. And after the legislators actually passed a map that maintained the minority districts, he vetoed that plan. And the initial congressional plan of the legislators did not go through. He continued to pressure the legislator to pass his map. And that map would force, the lines would cause a diminution or a lessening of Black voting power from 4 congressional districts to 2. The legislators did not uphold their duties and their responsibilities. We considered that a failure to take responsibility for the work they were supposed to do. The legislators were the ones who were supposed to draw the maps, not the governor. And as you saw in the clip, that's never happened before to our knowledge, where a governor would step in and draw a map and then force the legislators to follow the governor's map. The DeSantis plan literally obliterated, destroyed our Congressional District 5, which is in North Florida, and that was the congressional district that was held by Al Lawson. And that was in violation of the Florida Supreme Court ruling in 2015, and also Fair Districts itself. And this is the sad part. The legislators, they knew that the governor's maps would be very harmful to African Americans. And when they were asked, would it provide Black people with a representative of their choice, they actually admitted no. So they knew what they were doing. We could not sit by and allow that to happen. So shortly after the governor's map went through, the plaintiffs that you heard, we filed a lawsuit. Equal Ground, Education Fund, Black Voters Matter, Capacity Institute, League of Women Voters of Florida, and Florida Rising Together all got together. We sued Secretary of State Cord Byrd, Florida House of Representatives, and the Florida Senate. Why did we do that? We contend that we have been the beneficiaries of efforts for protection of voting rights these many years. And many people, some of whom remain nameless, we don't know their names. We know some famous people, but they marched in the streets. They were bitten by dogs, knocked down by water hoses, threatened and beaten. Some were killed. And they never knew if everything they were doing was going to yield the result. Well, that's why you file lawsuits, when you need to protect and for the values that you believe in, which is maintaining African American voting power and not allowing one party to have authority over the other. So that's what we're here for, and you'll hear more about it shortly. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Cecile. We really appreciate your insight and your expertise on this issue and grounding us on how we got here. So next, we're going to turn to our panelists for a series of questions. Joining us tonight are Jasmine Burney Clark, founder and director of Equal Ground Education Fund, Monet Holder, senior director of advocacy and programs at Florida Rising, Jamil Davis, state organizer for Black Voters Matter, and finally, Olivia Mendoza, director of litigation and policy at the National Redistricting Foundation. All right, welcome, Jasmine. So we're going to go ahead and start with you. Please, Jasmine, if you could, share a bit about the differences. What are the differences between the benchmark map prior to the DeSantis plan that was used in 2022 presidential election, please?
Perfect. So good evening, everyone. And I am really excited to be here this evening. Not only am I the founder and executive director of Equal Ground Education Fund, but I have been a lifelong resident of Florida, specifically Congressional District 5, which became Congressional District 10 a few years ago. The issue isn't just about work that I do on a daily basis, but it's also personal. And for the past 30 years of my 36 years of life, my congressional representation in this specific district has been the subject of litigation. So it's really important, as Cecile said, that we bring suit on issues similar to this. And thank you all for, again, tuning in with us this evening. So I want to talk a little bit about Florida's congressional districts and
please bear with us. We're having some technical difficulties. It'll just be one moment while we get Jasmine back here. Thank y'all so much for your patience. Okay, it looks like we're going to go ahead and move to Monet Holder. How you doing, Monet? So I've got a question for you while we're waiting. So we really saw quite a significant difference when it came to voter turnout in 2018 versus the 2022 election. I want to shift our attention. I would love for you to kind of share what the electoral impacts were from that election in using the 2022 map, and share any specific demographic information that you think would be helpful.
Sure. Thank you so much, Natasha, and good evening, everyone. Before I share numbers, I think it's very important to say, when we talk about the issue of redistricting and what we've seen happen here in Florida in the diminishment of Black representation as it relates to congressional seats and what, happened in the legislature, we know that there is indeed a direct correlation between attacks on democracy and voter turnout. It's not a coincidence. It is definitely by design. So some of the things I would want to share with you all, and if we can move to the slide that says 2022 midterm voters, is data that looks at turnout a bit differently. Instead of looking at all the registered voters, it really focuses on people who voted in 2020, and among the people who voted, what is the turnout rate in 2022 among different groups of voters? Because we talk about the disproportionate effect on Black and brown voters, it's important to know in our heads what the numbers are. So in 2022, as far as the midterm voters, we had an overall drop off in 2022 from 2020, and that drop off was 35%. Out of the folks who voted, we had 72% of white voter population turnout, which was actually a slight drop from 2018, in which 77% of white midterm voters turned out. When we think about non-white voters, so that's Black, Latino, and folks from the AAPI community, we had 53% of that population turnout, which was nearly a 20% decline from 2018, when we had 72% of midterm voters from that demographic show up to the polls. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So if we take a look at primary election by the numbers, so we know the primaries is extremely important because it actually sets the stage for what the general election will look like. In the primary election, the turnout was 25% compared to 27% in 2018. We had a total of 3.5 million votes that were cast, which sounds like a lot, but Florida has 14 million active voters on the rolls. Many of us or our friends and family, they voted by mail, and we saw that there were 2.3 million vote by mail ballots that were unreturned in Florida. So we're talking about an opportunity for millions to turn out, and some opportunities where millions did not, or millions of votes were not counted or casted. So it's a real testament of the people and the power that we have in the state, not just to turn out, but we turn that power into drawing lines for redistricting to make sure that when we turn out to the polls, we have fair and accurate representation for our communities, especially Black communities.
All right. Thank you so much, Monet. We really appreciate you sharing the significance of turnout in our elections. Next, we want to shift our attention to what I think is probably the most recent and important update in the Black Voters Matter versus Byrd litigation that came just days ago. We're going to kick it over to Olivia. Olivia, as a member of the litigation team for the National Redistricting Foundation, can you please explain to us what this new agreement between the plaintiffs and the state means? Additionally, we've seen Supreme Court decisions come down on cases throughout the South. And I'm curious what impact, if any, they have or would have here in the state of Florida.
Thank you, Natasha, so much. Very excited to be able to join you and everyone else tonight. And I think maybe what makes sense for me is for me to take those questions in reverse. And I'm going to start first with the questions around the Supreme Court decisions that came out this summer in regards to redistricting and how they may impact voters in Florida. And then we can talk a little bit more about the recent developments in the state case. So the first case that I want to cover with you is called Allen v. Milligan. It was formerly referred to as Merrill v. Milligan, just noting that so that people are not confused thinking that these are different cases. It is the same case. And in the heart of this case was the question of Section 2. So I want to talk briefly about what Section 2 is and the historical background, why it matters so much to our communities across the country. And so we can go ahead and move to the next slide there. Section 2, and we can go ahead and jump one more. Section 2 is a key component of the Voting Rights Act, which was passed, way back in 1965, as Cecilia alluded to in the beginning. This was a result of a lot of the hard work of our community leaders advocating for voting rights. And this prohibition is a powerful one because it really does not allow states to implement practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or language minority participation. So this can apply not just to redistricting, but discriminatory voter ID laws and any kind of election practices that can infringe on these rights. And so this was passed in 1965, and fast forward 20 years, 25 years, the Supreme Court had its, at the time, the most recent ruling in relation to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And it ruled that, states had to prove that there was intent behind the voting discrimination. And in response to that, Congress amended the law and said, no, no, no. When we crafted this law, this wasn't about having to prove intent. This was just an effects or the result of discrimination. So this is an important distinction, right? Because the intention of the lawmakers or the map makers isn't at issue here. The question is, does a voting practice or procedure result in discrimination on the basis of race, color, or language minority participation, whether or not intent can be proven? And so that is often what can be confusing about a Section 2 claim, but it's important to distinguish that in this legislation, Congress made very clear. And so following that decision by Congress, the court then, we can go ahead and move to the next slide. The court then had another landmark decision in where it said, okay, here are the rules of the game. If you're going to bring a Section 2 violation, a claim that the practice or procedure violated Section 2 in regards to redistricting, this is what you have to prove. And so this is what you often hear people refer to as the Jingles factors or the Jingles test or the Jingles preconditions. This is the test that came out of the Supreme Court saying these are the elements that need to be proven in order to bring a Section 2 claim. And I won't go into a lot of detail there, but I just wanted to note that that's what those mean, because since 1986, now moving to our current position where we are now, the Supreme Court really hadn't had any landmark decisions in relation to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But if you move to the next slide here, you'll see that that changed this summer. And what happened is a case that arose out of Alabama alleging that the state of Alabama had violated Section 2 and through the process made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And here the court affirmed the lower court's decision that had found that Alabama had violated Section 2. And so this was, I'm going to admit, a very surprising decision for many of those in the voting rights space. And partly, if you look here on the who composed the majority opinion, you have, Justice Roberts, Sotomayor, Kagan, Jackson, and Kavanaugh in part. And essentially what they said is that they found that what Alabama was trying to do was completely redo Section 2. And they were trying to change the tests, the two findings that I noted earlier, the Jingles test, as well as potentially the intention requirement in Section 2. And the court was not interested in entertaining that change to Section 2. Now, why does that matter to Florida? One of the main takeaways from this case is that the court's decision here reinforces the validity and the constitutionality of Section 2. And in so doing, it states that there are times when the map makers, the legislators, the commissions can consider race if they are doing so to remedy a constitutional or a statutory violation. So that's why this is important to Florida, as we just heard the impact that it has on Black and Latino communities and Asian communities in Florida is very real. And so this continues that acknowledgement that sometimes you do need to consider race. Now, it can't be a predominant factor, but it can be a consideration. in the remedy to some kind of violation that has been found. So that's the first case. The second case that we saw come out of the court this last session is called Moore v. Harper. And we can go to that next screen. And this case arose out of an issue in North Carolina. And on the gist of this case is essentially the North Carolina legislative or the North Carolina appellants who had appealed this case coming out of the Supreme Court in North Carolina really wanted to advance a theory that, and these are not just my words, these are words that everybody used from all the political spectrum, a fringe theory. What they were trying to advance is this theory called the Independent State Legislature, oftentimes called the ISL, which really was a misinterpretation of the US Constitution. And what it attempted to do was to remove any checks and balances on state legislative action in relation to federal elections. Now, all of us that are out there, we know as soon as you hear that, you're like, no, I learned that in middle school. Like checks and balances is a core component of our, government. And this theory, that's how far out there it was. It really was trying to remove any checks and balances on the state legislature. Of course, if they had advocated or advanced this theory, it would have had disastrous implications on redistricting, but also on federal elections as well, because it would have given essentially unfettered power to legislatures in regards to congressional redistricting. We can go ahead and move. I'm just going to touch very quickly on this slide. I really want to underscore how unprecedented and fringe theory this case was, and truly, to be honest with you, the court probably should not have taken it up in the first instance. This theory literally flies in the face of the court's decisions that had happened just a few years before, where they had acknowledged sort of the checks and balances that are built in, and or the other redistricting bodies like the commissions that make the maps in other states, and have given validity and credence to this work that is happening across the country. And it was really surprising that they even took this case up, because it would have not only undid what we understand to be our fundamental basics of government, but the precedent, right, which is something that we're not sure how far the court was willing to go to continue undue precedent from, as they had done the summer before with Dobbs and Roe v. Wade. So thankfully, the court did not choose this extreme theory as a valid process for moving forward when it comes to redistricting or federal elections more generally. And so in the next slide, you'll see that the court, again, an interesting composition of making up the majority. You'll see again Justice Roberts, Sotomayor, Kagan, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Jackson here in the majority. And what they ruled is that the Federal Elections Clause does not give exclusive and independent authority to state legislators to set the rules. Okay, why does that matter to Florida? The reason it matters to Florida is because should this have been decided in the other direction, and they had said, yes, the ISL theory is in fact how we are going to move forward in our governing of federal elections, then the protections that are afforded in the Florida Constitution, the Fair Districts Amendments, would essentially been nullified, right? They wouldn't be enforceable, because there would be no confines on the state legislature, either by the state constitutions potentially, or even by review of the state courts. So these are two important decisions that happened this summer that really have important impact and meaning to Florida, primarily in that they continue to put wind in the sails of the work that all of these organizations are doing currently, trying to fight and advocate for fair maps. And that really takes us to the last case, which is I'm just going to kind of quickly give an update on the most recent development in the litigation in regards to redistricting in the state case. And the biggest update, this just, hot off the presses, came out on Friday, is that there is a successful agreement that has been reached between the defendants and the plaintiff groups and the individual plaintiffs that are advancing these claims. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide. It gives you a little bit of a sort of the guiding principles of this agreement. One, it really helps move toward resolution after years of litigation. Cecile went through briefly some of the history that we had seen, and as far as passing the Fair Districts Amendments, had taken many years to reach resolution there. The goal here with this agreement is to try to find some kind of resolution in advance of 2024 elections. It also required the defendants or the state to concede on a factual basis that there was diminishment, that CD5 was a district that elected, that Black voters could elect their candidate of choice, and in the existing map, that is no longer the case. And in exchange for this pathway to a fair and legal CD5, the plaintiffs will not pursue the partisan gerrymandering claims, which are also protected in the Florida Constitution. And I apologize, I think I might have spoken longer than anticipated, but that is really a summary of the key cases across the country.
No worries at all. Thank you so much, Olivia, for laying out those details in a way that folks at home could actually understand. And it just reminds me, right, that the fight isn't over. We still got so much to do, but this is really, really good news that you're giving us here today. All right, so we're going to try to bring it back to Jasmine to give us a full update on the benchmark maps versus the 2022 map.
Thank you, Natasha. And as those maps are coming to the screen, I'll go ahead and get started. So just pointing out, in South Florida, in the benchmark plan, South Florida had two fiercely competitive seats, Congressional District 26 and Congressional District 27. Both of those seats were winnable by either party. The county is majority Hispanic according to the census, and although the population within the district is heavily tilted migrant, it does remove a rural county and does unfortunately dilute the vote there. In Tampa Bay, the DeSantis plan precisely does what the Florida Supreme Court told the legislature it could not do in 2015 litigation. And in Congressional District 14, it packs similar voters into a single district, jumping across Tampa Bay and taking away residents who have traditionally voted in Congressional District 13. And so this configuration splits one of Florida's major cities, specifically splits St. Petersburg's Black population in half, cracking Black voters into Congressional District 13 and Congressional District 14. In Central Florida, the district was relatively compact. At the start of the redistricting cycles, the district, specifically Congressional District 7, needed to lose only a small amount of the population to reach the population equality, and it did not need to be drastically reconfigured. However, the DeSantis map wholly reconfigures Congressional District 7 and sheds about 300,000 residents from the prior district. So the majority of those people are people of color and only retains about 30% of the original area that it encompassed. And then finally, in Congressional District 5, which is North Florida, there were essentially 367,000 Black voters who were dispersed across 4 congressional districts, diminishing their ability to select the representative of their choice. And so that is the difference between the benchmark map and the DeSantis map that was put forward. It's also important to note that Florida's current map reflects 1 additional congressional district. So our state, based on the 2020 census, went from 27 congressional districts to 28. We can go to the next slide. And so everyone in the state of Florida, as we know, must abide by the law, and that includes the governor. And so the governor should declare that our Constitution, is wrong and direct the entire state to follow what is a clear violation of the law. This is unfortunately what he has done in drawing maps that have drastically reduced Black congressional representation in the state. Next slide. And so we also should note that the governor has acknowledged, and you've heard already, that his redistricting maps do not comply with the Florida Supreme Court's 2015 ruling on fair districts. And the governor's actions have harmed every Floridian, regardless of race and regardless of party. So no matter what we look like and where we come from or what our office, that folks are holding, we believe as a coalition that everyone must obey the law, no matter what they look like, where they come from. We all deserve a voice to be heard, and that includes a voice in Congress through our congressional representation. Next slide. So the governor's congressional redistricting plan has, as we've already demonstrated, diminished Black representation. And while statewide elections in Florida are decided by fractions of a percent, the governor's plan unfortunately does rig a map overwhelmingly in favor of
Unfortunately, it looks like we lost Jasmine there again. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of finish us up here. And so what she was saying was that while statewide elections in Florida are decided by fractions of a percent, the governor's plan has rigged the map overwhelmingly, in favor of the Republican Party, right? To be frank, and it violates the Fair District Amendments, which require nonpartisan redistricting lines. Next slide, please. And so we want to talk about, right, what we are supposed to be, dealing with here when it comes to this attack on democracy. Every community in Florida has come under attack and fallen victim to this governor's divisive agenda, right? Because when one community is hurting, we're all hurting. And it's aimed at sort of the most extreme elements of his political base, right? It's for his political ambitions, not for actually serving the people of the state. Moving on to the next slide, please. And the new map that was put out likely violates the Florida Constitution, Amendment 6 in 2010, which was approved by 63% of Florida's voters. That means Republicans and Democrats, right? Prohibits diluting the opportunity to elect racial and language minorities to Congress. The amendment also prohibits the diminishment of racial or language minority congressional districts, regardless of the intent of the map drawers. So ultimately, the governor's attack on democracy and on Black representation, like I said, is driven by his ambition, likely to run for the next highest office. As we know, he already announced his run for president. It's a transparent attempt to gain favor, and we really are here to demand fairness. So the next thing that we're going to do, thank you, Jasmine, for setting us all up and explaining the map differences, is wrap up this discussion tonight. We're going to conclude with you, Jamil. I see you on the screen there, to tell those listening and watching what they can expect next from this coalition, please.
Good evening, everyone. So there's a lot to expect from this coalition. We have plenty of things that you can do. So we have plenty of things that you can do. Of course, you can stay connected with us by scanning the QR code. The QR code will take you to where you can sign up for more information on what's to come from our coalition of organizations that are a part of this lawsuit. Of course, as you know, freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. Of course, that is stated by the illustrious Mrs. Coretta Scott King. Next slide. In conclusion, we must remain vigilant against those who want to erode our voting rights. So please continue to follow and support our organizations as this case progresses. Also, we want you to know that you can continue to engage and educate your community on the power of redistricting. Redistricting sets the ground rules for who we can elect to make decisions that matter to us. And once again, please do remember that as we're staying vigilant against those who want to erode our voting rights, you can continue to follow and support our organizations as this case progresses. Next slide. And this is how you can get in contact with us. Various organization emails, as you can see. You can contact Jasmine Bernie Clark over at Equal Ground at info@equalground.com. Contact Cecile Schoon over at info@leagueofwomenvoters.org. Contact Ms. Monet Holder over at monet@floridarising.org. And you can contact myself over at jamil@blackvotersmatter.org. Thank you all so much. And back to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Jamil. And thank you, everybody, for watching at home. Special thanks to League of Women Voters Florida, Equal Ground, Black Voters Matter, and Florida Rising for leading in this fight for equal representation in the state of Florida. Remember, we're in this together to protect our democracy so that everyone, no matter who we are or what we look like, is fairly represented in our government and has a seat at the table. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.